Welcome to panel 3. Thank you. It is my pleasure and my honor to moderate panel 3, which is to explore the problems of sources and secrets. We have already heard in panels 1 and 2 a great deal about the problems of sources and just a little bit about secrets. In the meantime, we've heard about the kinds of new questions that biographers and memoirists of women ask and have entered this kind of questioning into the larger general field of both biography and memoir writing. I want to begin by introducing our panelists, but I also want to give you some late-breaking news with regard to one of them. First, I'm going to introduce Marnie Muller, who will be followed by Carla Kaplan, who will be followed by Blanche Cook, and you have their brief bios in your program. The late-breaking news is from Carla, who has received an NEH Public Scholar Program grant for the writing of her book on Jessica Mitford, and we wanted to tell you, we wanted to make sure you knew this because she says it is a new program and that you should be aware of it. So it's called the NEH Public Scholar Program, and those of you who are seeking grants should write it right down. Without any more ado, we begin the panel with Marnie Muller.
Okay, can you hear me fine? Yeah, okay. This is my first foray into memoir. Can you hear? Really, that close? Okay. I mean,
caress it, I like to say.
Okay.
Yes, caress it.
Now, if I can see what I'm reading. This is my first foray into both memoir and a little smattering of biography. I'm a novelist, so I've never gone into this. But the memoir/biography I'm speaking about today is the story of my friendship with Mary Montoy, a Japanese-American performer. Her secret was the source of my wanting to write the book. I thought I knew her well when she was alive. I was her friend from the time we met in 1994 at a focus group for the Japanese American National Museum. That evening, we found that we were the only two people in the room who had lived in Japanese American internment camps during World War II. She, in Minidoka, in Idaho, incarcerated against her will. And I was born in the Tule Lake High Security Segregation Camp in Northern California, where my Caucasian parents had gone to work to try to make an intolerable situation tolerable for the people forced to live there. Mary had always told me that she was only half Japanese and that her father had been a Chinese doctor in Molokai, Hawaii, in Father Damien's leper colony. He had died when she was 2, and her mother had remarried an Issei man, and they'd moved to Seattle. It was only after Mary's death, when I became the executor of her estate, that I discovered that this was a false story. She had been born in Seattle to 2 Issei parents. She was totally Japanese-American, or Nisei. As I went through her vast collection of theatrical photos, scripts, and press clippings, I saw that she had self-described, sometimes as Chinese-American, at others as half Chinese and half Korean, and often as ethnic Hawaiian, never as Japanese-American. Why had she masked her ethnicity, I wanted to know. I had no problem documenting the progression of her 4-decade career, beginning with her rapid rise from showgirl on the chop suey circuit to white vaudeville to glamorous lead singer at swank nightclubs to the Latin Quarter to legitimate Broadway theater in the African-American musical House of Flowers to a role in the world of Susie Wong and onto television and film. She was not famous, but she always got work. She was not hidden behind any famous man. She was out there entirely on her own, making her way through the obstacles of discrimination against Asian Americans, sexism, stereotypical Asian roles, and not the least, ageism due to her delayed start. What I didn't have was the documentation of her private life before I knew her, save for torrid letters from her many lovers, in which I could discern the pattern of her affairs, letters from other actors, a smattering of correspondence from her recently deceased brother, and remembrances of a few of her still living friends. Almost none of the people I spoke with were aware that she was Japanese American, and certainly not that she had been interned with 120,000 other people of Japanese descent during World War II. I decided to follow her secret, to see what I could unearth on a political and personal level. But I needed to know her real name. Not an easy prospect, as she'd covered her tracks well. I eventually pieced together her birth name, Mary Teruko Watanabe. There was also a last name, Okada, that had been appended to her Social Security records. I threw that into the mix along with her birth date. I submitted a request for her files from the National Archives, a source I had also used to research my novel about my parents' tenure in Tule Lake. I hit pay dirt. As Blanche knows, the Roosevelt era is our government's most documented period in American history, and the files on the internment camps yield shockingly intimate and detailed private material on the internees. The tragic incarceration of people of Japanese descent is a boon to researchers. I learned that Mary had wed Shigesato Okada 2 months before Pearl Harbor, the event that precipitated the mass internment. I learned that she developed enormous dermoid ovarian tumors and suffered the removal of her ovaries in the camp hospital during the same week in August of 1942 when I was born in another tar paper covered hospital 1,000 miles away. I discovered the only extant letters written by her in which her intelligence, diligence, and ability to negotiate at the age of 26 the most trying of tasks, obtaining release from the camp for herself, her husband, her brother, and her parents. I learned that her marriage to Shig did not survive the tribulations of their almost 2 years in camp. Mary Teru Watanabe Okada arrived alone in New York City in the fall of 1943, where she attended the Juilliard School on scholarship. In 1946, at the age of 30, after being told by her music instructor that she could never get a role in opera, not even as Madame Butterfly, because she was Asian, she scoured the trades. She answered a call for Oriental girls 5, 6, and over and landed her first job as a showgirl in the slant-eyed scandals at the China Doll Club on Times Square. Teruko Watanabe Okada gave way to Mary Moan, a China doll, and later to Mary Montoy. Why did she change her name? I first surmised that it was because she was performing before servicemen, many of whom could have just returned from the Pacific Front and could even have been involved in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But as I dug deeper, I discovered in our government's confidential files that in the spring of 1944, after she had been living in New York City for 6 months, she was called before a war relocation panel in Manhattan for the purpose of determining if she should be sent back to camp. Shig went through the same ordeal in Cleveland. He had an FBI file in which he had been described as an agitator in camp. Mary was assumed a suspect by association with him. They were both cleared and finally awarded permanent leave clearance. In the very same month, a disturbing incident erupted whereby Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, usually pro-immigrant, vociferously complained for all to hear that the government was, in his words, dumping Japanese Americans from the camps onto New York City, and he wanted them sent back to the West Coast. Mary's friend, the choreographer and dancer, Emiko Tokunaga, almost the only person to whom Mary had confided that she was Japanese American, told me that Mary was afraid to reveal herself, afraid that she could be sent back to camp or even expatriated to Japan, a place she'd only visited on one trip as a teenager to meet her mother's family. Which brings me to the question of, should I have revealed the secret that she hadn't completely revealed even to me? the person she had trusted with her, with her bodily care during the last years of her life, the person with whom she had the bond of having been in a camp, who knew her darkest hour. But think of this. As her career progressed, a piece of her was always missing, the piece that the American government had criminalized, her ethnicity. In 1974, she performed in an off-Broadway play entitled Santa Anita 42, based on the Santa Anita Assembly Center, which was notorious for having housed people in horse stalls that hadn't been cleaned of manure and straw. Mary had been housed in another, equally inhumane assembly center as she awaited transport to the Minidoka camp. When I reached the director to ask how she had identified herself to him and the rest of the camp, he said she told people she was half Japanese and half Chinese. Did she tell them that she was in a comparable assembly center? No, he said, which is weird because most actors share their applicable experience in rehearsals. It's said that we become the lie. I know the truth of that. I too passed during my childhood up into my young adulthood, hiding the fact of being Jewish behind my father's Christian name. I know the terror of being found out. I know how hard it is to give up the secret. But I also know the enormous relief of finally revealing oneself. Mary was never able to totally let go of her cover. Though she walked on picket lines in the 1980s protesting yellow-face casting, in print interviews she still identified as a Chinese-American actor. She would always insist to me that she had to write her own obituary, that no one else could get it right. When I sent her obituary to the New York Times, I unwittingly perpetuated the lie. I've come to understand that Mary longed for her Japanese connection. When we went out to dinner, we had to eat Japanese, especially Japanese country food that her mother made when she was alive. We never ate Chinese food. When Mary died, she left all of her considerable estate, close to $500,000, to her first cousin in Japan, a man she barely knew. And in her will, she stipulated that I was to send her ashes to Japan for a Buddhist burial. Mary's story is illustrative of the power of shame and fear of exposure that has lived within people of Japanese descent as a result of their internment. Her choice to pass was not made out of cowardice, but one of resilience, fueled by her need to go forward into the America that had betrayed her. I've decided to tell what she had not been able to divulge so that the world can know who she was in the totality of herself. A small act of reparations on my part, or redress, as it's called in the Japanese American community.
Thank you, Marnie. That's a very moving story, and we're all looking forward to that memoir. Next, Carla Kaplan.
Sound okay? Usually they can hear me in Oklahoma, yeah? Okay. I want to risk giving up 30 seconds of my 10 minutes to thank Dorothy and Marnie. That was an amazing talk, and Blanche and the organizers. It's a real privilege to be here, and I thank you. The first two panels were just great, and this talk relates in many ways to both of them. In some ways, it's about the challenges that the second wave has left us as a legacy of biographers, and in other ways, it's about what I would call the dark side of some of our empathies as feminists. And those are issues that came up in the first two panels. We were not asked to title our remarks today, but if I had, my title would go like this. Carla says I'm too loud. Okay, my other Carla says I'm too loud. How's this? Is that better? Carla, is that better? Okay, she's waving at me. If I had titled these remarks, my title would be Rescue Missions, Anonymity, Iconicity, and the Problem of Mess. Yes, that word was mess. This panel was asked to talk about the ways that the written records of women's lives are compromised, partial, hidden amongst the papers of more famous husbands, sons, or fathers, unarchived altogether, unindexed if archived, thrown away, or if saved, kept secret, a set of conditions that are all too common in researching women's lives and that are as persistent a problem for 20th century women as for 18th, and remarkably, almost as common for well-known women as for those who were unknown. These challenges became shadow subjects in all three of my biographical books. Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance, and Queen of the Muckrakers, The Life and Times of Jessica Mitford. And it was surprising how much these were problems because some of the women I've written about are well known indeed. Some, like Hurston, are in fact feminist icons. But again and again, those of us who do the work, as Carla Peterson put it, of pushing back the dark, especially who do that work to uncover the lives of women of color, find the shattering relevance still of Woolf's Judith Shakespeare, of Tilly Olson's mute, inglorious Miltons. The unnatural silences in the lives of women artists, the censorship silences, the self-censorship silences, the foreground silences of devaluation, of motherhood, of privileges denied, of recognition withheld. The rescue imperative, given all of that, seems unavoidable. We become, as feminist biographers, the champions of our subjects. We are their heroines. We so often are working with women whose archives remind us every single day they are in one way or another in need of rescue. Indeed, the Zora Neale Hurston I worked on when I first worked on her went from relative obscurity to extraordinary celebrity, revealing all sides of this problem, all four kinds of silence, if you were here this morning. Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, was a hybrid book of biography and letters which appeared in 2002, and even that late in our history was the first major collection of the letters of any Black woman artist, intellectual, or writer. And I started it when many of Hurston's unpublished works were still uncatalogued and unlocated. Indeed, I was lucky enough to be present at the Library of Congress on the day 12 of Hurston's plays were uncovered. When I set off to locate Hurston's letters, people still said, "Zora, who?" And her estate was comprised of relatives who had never met one another, let alone worked together. Hurston died, as most of you know, in Fort Pierce, Florida in January of 1960, and if it had not been for Black Deputy Sheriff Patrick Duvall, all of her personal effects, which included at that time her entire, what she maintained as her archive, would have been burned. When I went in search of her letters, the Gainesville Library had finally taken that soggy, steaming, burned mess out of Pat Duvall's hands and put it between Mylar sheets. But much of the acclaim she now enjoys was still in Hurston's future. Her own records, such as they were only very partially available. But in any case, she was not one of those writers, in spite of being an absolutely extraordinary correspondent, who would have been able to keep a carbon of every letter she wrote. She often wrote while she was on the road, or who would have had a place that was stable enough that she could store her own materials. And would it have made a difference? Hurston's letters, of course, were not in her own archives. They were in the papers of those to whom she wrote. A range of friends, only a few of whom, like Langston Hughes and Carl Van Vechten, achieved enough fame to have well-organized archives. Many of Hurston's friends and her female co-workers, like folklorist Carita Doggett-Corse, interracial activist Sarah Lee Creech, and agent Jean Parker Waterbury, had some boxes in their attics, but no archives. I was lucky. I was dogged. I traveled across the country and I talked my way into dozens of homes. I learned to recognize Hurston's handwriting, her typewriters, her various stationaries, and her style. And while I had projected that I might find some 200 or so letters, thinking I was probably stretching the truth, my Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters eventually did contain over 600, many of which dramatically altered how we see Hurston, and that led to a secrets problem. Hurston at that time was well on her way to being one of the most celebrated black women in American history, a symbol for many people of resistance, an icon of resistance and rebellion. But what I found was not always synchronous with that rising reputation. For example, I discovered that during the HUAC ordeal, Hurston called the commission and said, "I have names I want to give you." Some people urged me to leave it out of the book, and I refused to do so. It was a very controversial and for some people still contested decision for me to reveal that piece of her past. But I felt that that was an important responsibility I had to Hurston, not just as a scholar, but as a feminist, to try to tell the messiest story I possibly could. Miss Ann and Harlem, the White Women of the Black Renaissance, a group biography of the white women of the Harlem Renaissance, grew directly out of the Hurston book and its archival gaps. It was a project that came out of my very complicated efforts to research the white women with whom Hurston was friends, most of whom had never been written about, and if they'd been written about, their writing was incorrect and there were very few archives for any of them. In the process of writing that book, I found many unknown women who proved extremely hard to research. One of them was a white woman named Lillian E. Wood, who had passed all her life in public as a black writer. I happened, luckily, on her typescript autobiography, and I finally found a photograph of her in the most unlikely way possible. I had been looking for her records at the black college she taught in for 35 years of her life. It's called Morristown College. It's completely abandoned now. All of the records from Morristown went into one of two places, either a dumpster or to one of the historically black colleges named Knoxville, which just closed down a year ago after being down to only 11 students. They hope to reopen. When I went to Knoxville in search of Lillian E. Wood, they had acquired some of the papers of Morristown, but they didn't have enough money to pay their electric bill. So for me, they turned on a tiny electrical panel near the Xerox machine, near the windows. They didn't have enough money to turn on the lights for me. And they let me Xerox the Morristown College daybooks by daylight only on the Xerox machine connected to the one electrical panel that was turned on. I think about that as we think about what's available in records and what isn't. In the course of writing that book, any number of secrets came up that I had to contend with what I was going to do about. And that very much relates to some of the panels we heard this morning. So just a moment on another Josephine. There was a Josephine in my book on the Harlem Renaissance who was George Schuyler's white wife. Her name was Josephine Cogdell Schuyler. She left behind unpublished novels and a trove of tiny little diaries written in a brown ink which fades over time worse than any other color, and that were crosshatched as if she had been a Victorian. Tiny, awful little diaries in which she described the writing process of her husband's life in ways that made it really clear to me how closely their writing was entwined. Once she gave birth to their biracial daughter, Philippa, she never again published under her own name. She adopted, as I discovered, 6 pseudonyms, most of them black people, and she passed as all of them in her writing. In the course of this work and through her diaries, I was able to surmise, to hypothesize, to speculate that in all likelihood, great swaths of George Schuyler's most famous novel, Black No More, are written by Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, including that novel's portrayal, which is a very complicated portrayal of a white woman. But like so many of the things we work on as feminist biographers of women, I can't prove it. What do you do with a blockbuster theory like that? Talk about the hunch, right? It was a great hunch, which I could only present as a likely hunch. Now, writing the biography of Jessica Mitford, I face seemingly opposite problems. Mitford's archive is simply ginormous. It is well indexed. There is very little that has been unseen, although I did find 6 unopened envelopes. But no big secrets so far, and her family supports my efforts to tell a very messy story and to get everything onto the table. But for me, as a feminist biographer, the principle of telling a messy story still obtains. What I learned about the importance of telling a messy story in my previous 2 books, I hope, will help me deal with some of the complications in Jessica Mitford's life. Her CP membership, she was so late to renounce it. Her alcoholism, her bad mothering according to everyone who knew her, and complications in her marriage. But more importantly, I hope that my commitment to mess will help me to understand the key contradictions in her own character. And there are 2 that loom largest that relate to this morning. One was about empathy. If anyone could be said to have revitalized the American tradition of the empathetic, muckraking writer, it was Jessica Mitford. And yet she was known for being the most unsympathetic and unempathetic of people in her personal life. Always cool, always unemotional about others' travails. That's an interesting contradiction that can't be told, I suspect, in an easy way. But for me, as a feminist biographer, the more complicated one is that this woman, so path-breaking, so pioneering, who led such an enormous life, who broke all of the rules, always decried feminism, eschewed the label, claimed that she was not a feminist, and distanced herself from the feminist movement. What I'm hoping is that the commitment to messiness that the archival gaps of my previous 2 books necessitated for me is going to be an intellectual support I can use to understand why somebody who led as feminist a life as Jessica Mitford never claimed that she was a feminist. And in fact, the problem then of researching someone with an enormous archive can be very much like the problem of researching someone who leaves very little archive or whose life is shrouded in secrecy.
Thank you. And all of this leads inevitably to Blanche Cook.
Oh dear, she says. Oh dear. Well, I'm not going to stand up, right? I'm going to stay here like everybody else.
Is it on?
I don't know. Is it on? Oh, good. You can see why we get so much from each other and why at this 25th anniversary of our existence, we continue to love and rely on each other. And I just want to say a word of great, great gratitude for this day, this panel, and all the 25 years that we have been together. Thank you. I did finish volume 3. It is in. It is being edited. It is being reduced by half, I am told. I understand there are now outtakes, so you could sort of have your outtakes in a little e-file or something like that. Let me just say that this is called Sources and Secrets. And I got very hung up by the idea of sources and secrets because I feel like I'm a crossover person. I started in this life as a military historian, and I was very happy as a military historian. I even taught at West Point on and off for several years. And then I did a book on Dwight David Eisenhower called The Declassified Eisenhower, where everything I wanted was secret and classified. And I always say my life is an accident. I had an accident when I was a phys ed major, a tumbler, a gymnast. A boy put a barbell at the end of my mat as I was coming out of a triple flip. And I couldn't major in phys ed anymore, so I had to major in other things. So I majored in history, anthropology, and political science. And then I went to Johns Hopkins, and that's where I became a military historian. And then I became a syndicated columnist, and I wrote an article on Eisenhower for the Los Angeles Times in 1972 saying all good conservatives should vote for George McGovern, the real heir to Eisenhower's. Anyway, the president of Doubleday called me up and said, would you like to write a book on Eisenhower? And I said, no, but call my agent. And my agent said, listen, kid, you don't hang up on the president of Doubleday. Anyway, that got me to Abilene to look at Eisenhower's papers, where everything I wanted to look at was secret. And I always say, never go anywhere without your gang. So I went back to New York and called a meeting. And a bunch of us, Bill Preston, Jerry Markowitz, folks who, journalists and historians, founded something called the Fund for Open Information and Accountability. And Bella Abzug was in Congress, and she gave us the Sunshine Law and the Freedom of Information Act. And so then I got some Eisenhower papers released, declassified. That's the name of my book, The Declassified Eisenhower, the core of which is the overthrow of Guatemala in 1954 and the overthrow of Iran in 1953. And if you want to understand the incredible mess we're in now, which is arguably the worst mess we've ever been in, Edith Ballantyne at The Hague this summer when Claire and I, in April, when Claire and I were at The Hague for the 100th anniversary of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Edith Ballantyne, who was one of the very, very few people rescued in 1938, has worked for WILF all of her life, said this is the worst moment in human history. That is arguable, but it is certainly one of the worst moments in human history given the literally millions of refugees. And it all starts, well, I don't know when it all starts. I suppose we could say it all starts with World War I, but one war bleeds into the next, and here we are in a very insane moment. So after I finished that book and got all these documents declassified, the Reagan administration started to reclassify things. And I got appointed by the State Department to the Historical Committee of the State Department, where I served for almost 10 years, to fight for documents that were going to be reclassified. And I have to say, if you do international relations, look at the Foreign Relations of the U.S. series that's published by the State Department every year. It's an unbelievable story of what we're allowed to know and what we're not allowed to know. And the bottom line is we are not allowed to know a lot of things. And there's something, in my opinion, really disgusting about the war against journalists and whistleblowers right now. I mean, Chelsea Manning should be out of prison. Edward Snowden should be out of exile. I mean, this is disgusting. But it's in a great tradition. What does this have to do with secrets and sources? While I served on that committee, it was the 1980s, and because there were secrets about Eleanor Roosevelt, a really crappy book had come out on Lorena Hickok, a really stupid book by a woman named Doris Faber, who wanted to burn all these letters because she was the first person who looked at the Lorena Hickok letters, and she thought these were horrible things that should be burned, and she told the archivist they should close the letters. Anyway, when I reviewed this book, and then I called my friend Joe Lash, and I said, why didn't you have Lorena Hickok in anything you wrote about Eleanor Roosevelt? And he said, Well, I hated her. Let's have dinner. And so we had dinner. Joe was my friend because he blurbed my Crystal Eastman book, saying this is a book that should stay in print forever. And you get to be friends with people who blurb your book that way. So Joe and I had dinner, and he said, I hated her because she was a bigot, and she hated me because I was a Jew. And so we never wanted to write about her. And there's also a lot of jealousy. All the people in Eleanor Roosevelt's life thought they were the first in Eleanor Roosevelt's life, and they all hate each other. Like Edna Gurevich said, Truda Lash, who's one of the most wonderful and noble people I've ever met, was a liar and a fraud. Imagine that. So there are all these lies and hostilities. Anyway, Joe took me up to Hyde Park saying, and my first reaction to his saying I should write about Eleanor Roosevelt, the goddess must forgive me, was, well, you know I don't do that. I do military history. I do hard history. I actually said that. And this is my Eisenhower book had just come out. It was, I guess, 80, 78. Anyway, by the time Joe took me up to Hyde Park, I saw that there was a story here because he was the good son. Anything Eleanor Roosevelt said, he said. Anything she didn't want to deal with, he didn't deal with. She said, I don't care about power. She said that to him, and so he wrote she didn't care about power. And then I knew I had a story. But the bottom line is, as Joe has said many times, Eleanor Roosevelt is infinite. And one of the stories is when I worked at the State Department, I said to my boss, whose name was Bill Slaney, I said, look at all this stuff you send me before every meeting. He sent me like a mountain of paper to be prepared for the meeting. I said, where is Eleanor Roosevelt's State Department file? From 1946 to 53, when Eisenhower fired her, she worked for the State Department at the United Nations, representing the U.S., creating something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the U.S. has still not ratified. The economic and social rights, the U.S. has still not ratified it. And Truman said, don't vote for that. Don't vote for that, the economic and social rights. Those are communist rights. The Soviets introduced them. And Eleanor Roosevelt said, you cannot talk human rights to people who are hungry. So we have to reclassify Eleanor Roosevelt, who's really a socialist. Can I use that word? Now that the Pope has been here, and he said capitalism is the dung of the devil, I can say Eleanor Roosevelt is a socialist, can't I? Yes. So, so there are all kinds of things that I'm very excited about, but there are still breaking secrets, and there is still, how much time do I have?
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, okay. So there are still breaking secrets, and there are still things we cannot understand and we don't know. And let me just say, one of the great here, and nobody's written about 2 people that I want really to highlight. Nobody has written about Gertrude von Adam Wenzel Pratt Lash, Truda Lash. And this is a truly remarkable woman who graduated from the University of Freiburg with her PhD in 1931, came to the U.S. to teach at Hunter in 1931, met Elliot Pratt, one of the richest, Pratt Institute, Pratt Oil, went back to Berlin to edit an anti-Nazi paper. Elliot Pratt followed her, married her. They had 4 children. And then in 1940, she met Joe Lash and fell in love with Joe Lash. And Eleanor Roosevelt gets totally involved. This is a big part of Volume 3. Gets totally involved in that romance and urges and really pushes them to get divorced. Isn't that interesting? Elliot Pratt, and Truda Lash was, you know, one of these great, tall, blonde Valkyries married to Elliot Pratt. I mean, she's about 6 foot, and he's about 6'4", and, you know. and Joe Lash is my height. And Elliot Pratt writes to her, why do you want a divorce? You have all the freedom you need. I mean, clearly they had an open marriage. To make a very long story short about sources, her children, the Elliot Pratt and Truda's children gave me 10 boxes of materials that Truda didn't want anybody to use, not Joe, not anybody. And before she died, I said, what's up with nobody giving you credit for the Varian Fry rescue operation, which is the famous rescue operation, Varian Fry in Marseille, that rescues about 1,200 people. And this was on her deck in Martha's Vineyard, and she banged her fist on the deck, and everything fell off. And she said, don't write that. And I said, well, I'm going to write that. What's the story? Why is it a secret? And she, big sigh, and she said, to protect my family. But then she wrote me a letter saying, okay, it's true, you can write it, before she died. And I thought she meant to protect her children, but Joe never protected her children when he wrote about their, secret affair thing here. I mean, he wrote all about it. And so her children told me, no, it was protect her family, which is to say, she had 2 brothers who fought here and 2 brothers who fought there. She had a sister who was such a Nazi that she wouldn't even meet Joe ever, and a mother who ultimately changed. And Truda becomes really one of the great political activists in Eleanor Roosevelt's tradition, with the Wiltwyck School for Troubled Boys, with the Committee of Children, and she does incredible work all throughout her life. So that really deserves somebody's attention and a biography. Let me just say, I started out by saying when I worked in the State Department, I said to my boss, look at all the stuff you send me. And I said, well, what do you think about the State Department's correspondence with Eleanor Roosevelt and her correspondence with her advisors? And he said, well, let's go look for it. And so we went to the National Archives, and we found 198 boxes. 198 boxes of Eleanor Roosevelt State Department materials, which have never been used. There's a book by Marianne Glendon. She didn't use them. I have to admit, I'm not going to use them. I'm done. Somebody else is going to have to do it. But they're amazing, and they include great big mysteries, like what happened to Raoul Wallenberg. And in Eleanor Roosevelt's papers in the State Department, Raoul Wallenberg's mother, Madge, writes to Eleanor Roosevelt saying, as the greatest heart in the world, can you help me find my son? And Eleanor Roosevelt writes to all her State Department friends and says, well, what's going on here? And we still don't know why the Soviets arrested Raoul Wallenberg, who saved so many lives in Budapest. And it's just one of the great historical mysteries of World War II. So there are things in her paper, I mean, I am dealing with that, but there are things in her papers on U.S. policy, on race, and on South Africa that really, really is very important. There's some things that are amazing and ongoing, like the U.S. failure to rescue, failure to deal with refugees during World War II. And in that context, there are some really evolving stories. And one is a woman named Eleanor Rathbone. There's a new biography of Clementine Churchill. In this new biography of Clementine Churchill, Winston Churchill's wife, much like Eleanor Roosevelt, really treated how she stayed married to that man is really a question. It's a wonderful biography. But how Clementine Churchill would be convinced and persuaded by Eleanor Rathbone to do something very specific when she went to save lives and support the Russian wounded in Moscow in 1944-45, and Eleanor Rathbone gave her a whole list of things to do, and she does them. Eleanor Rathbone had a committee to save the perishing. There was a parliamentary committee to save the perishing. Eleanor Roosevelt had a friend on that committee, Lady Stella Redding. I have these papers. I have Lady Stella Redding's papers. Why is there no mention anywhere of Lady Rathbone, of Eleanor Rathbone in this correspondence? And so there are these big questions, like Dorothy Helly has just told me. Chop, chop. Okay, one other. I'll come back to it. Vera Brittain. I just want to say Vera Brittain, whose incredible pacifist, anti-bombing essays out of World War II are so important. And her daughter, now a member of Parliament, Shirley Williams, has just published this incredible collection in which Vera Brittain, this really great radical anti-war activist who fights against saturation bombing, massacre bombing. During the war, Eleanor Roosevelt criticizes Vera Brittain, but the very first person she has dinner with, in London when she's there to represent the UN, is Vera Brittain, which changes the story. Because when Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened, Eleanor Roosevelt said, this is a new day. We have to do everything we can to stop war, or war will stop life.
Thank you, Blanche. Now we're going to have a foreshortened discussion between the among the three panelists right now.
So a kind of a genre, oh no, if I do this, Carla will do Hampton here. I'm not going to pull this close. You can hear me, right? So this is a version of, it's not on. So it won't make any difference, Blanche. Turn it up. Now it makes a difference. Okay. So a question for each of you that is a genre question for each, and that has to do with the ways in which the character as a category we think about as a fictional character is in fact part of the work we do. And so my version of this, Marnie, for you is just wondering if at all working on someone who you knew and revealing her life, if that makes her more or less of a character, and if it reveals a sort of shadow memoir for you that is in telling her story if yours has changed. And then a version of this question for Blanche would go something like this, which is, now you've just done volume 3, and I'm really interested to know if in any way volume 3 changes your own perception of the Eleanor Roosevelt that you not only wrote about in volumes 1 and 2, but really created. I mean, the rescue work of bringing back hidden history creates a character to whom, for all kinds of political reasons, we can become very wedded. And I'm wondering if you've had to change your mind in any way about the character you created in really telling the story of Eleanor Roosevelt. So those are my character questions for both of you.
Well, you hit on one of the biggest is this on or not?
It's on. It's on.
Just pull it to you.
This was one of the biggest problems I had with this book. Part of the book was about my relationship with her, but a lot of it I felt an obligation to tell her story. But everyone kept saying to me, but you've got to put your story in. Because what makes this really interesting is a Caucasian person who really understands the camps, who has, a deep connection to them. So it was very hard for me to do it, but I gradually did it. And one of the things that happened was that I began to find unbelievable coincidental connections with her that I had no idea of. One was, she and my mother were born within a week of each other. She and my mother went to the same high school together. She and my mother lived within half a mile of each other. There's some letters that were written to her before she was married from a young man, and a young Nisei man who I had thought was maybe the husband. And in those letters, he talks about the cooperative movement, he talks about peace issues, he talks about all sorts of things like this. And at the end of one letter, he bemoans the fact that she's getting engaged. But he said, is a Nisei man. But I'm happy because I just got into Phi Beta Kappa at Berkeley, and my family is happy. So I decided to track him down to find out what happened to him. I tracked him down. I called the Phi Beta Kappa office. They said, well, the files probably aren't here, but I can go and look, at the Bancroft Library. So she loved the story. So within, I would say 3 hours, I get a message back. Oh, and I had said, my aunt was in Phi Beta Kappa at Berkeley at about that time. Turns out they were both tapped for Phi Beta Kappa in the same group, so my aunt knew him. So then she also sent me his obituary. It turned out that he had been with the Berkeley Co-op. He had then not gone to camp. He had gone to the Rochdale Institute to study, and he had come back to be at the Berkeley Co-op. My father got his first learning about co-ops there. My father went on to Tule Lake to organize the cooperative system within that camp and other camps. And I thought, this man could have known my father. Well, to make a long story short, they did know each other. Yeah. So these stories started intertwining. And what it did was this is the end of it, but I never knew that I had a place in America. There was some place where I was always outside America, racially, in all sorts of different ways. And I suddenly saw I had a place in America. I belonged within this intellectual, political, Japanese American and Caucasian Northwestern America, and it was my place. And that's what I found. And that started to spur me on to feel freer, to own the material, to own my own material, and to own my connection to her material.
Carla, that's such a good question. Can I ask you to?
You are allowed to ask Carla questions.
Okay. So do you want to go next? Sure. Okay. So I think that question is really fascinating in terms of your work on Zora Neale Hurston and now on Jessica Mitford.
I think it was a problem question for me with Hurston because I was not just riding that wave from obscurity to celebrity. I was very much helping to create it. And the Hurston I was uncovering just did not fit with the character most people wanted. I think I learned even more about her in the last book, but I do think what I also came to see was that it's not necessarily a bad thing that we turn our biographical subjects into characters. I think character is the way we approach subjectivity, and that just being conscious of that is not a bad thing. So Mitford is always referred to as a character, right? Everyone says, she's such a character, you're so lucky to be right. And I thought, oh, that's really true. And it's true in the other sense. It's true in the literary sense. And I'm trying to work with that now in the biography, which is not to say that she's fictionalized in my biography, but she is a version. And my Mitford is a version, as my Hurston was a version, as your Eleanor Roosevelt, so importantly, right, was a version. And I'm not seeing enough written about the way in which, as feminist biographers and historians, we can embrace the fact that we're creating versions and that that's okay.
That's great. Have you interviewed Dinky?
Oh, yes. We spent a lot of time.
Oh, good.
The question was, have I interviewed Dinky? And that's Jessica Mitford's daughter. I guess I would turn it around and say, Dinky's interviewed me.
As she would,
And if you know Dinky, you know what I'm saying.
And she runs the Janine Freedom Theater support group that we're
And
part
Blanche,
of.
do you have an answer to Carla's question?
I was looking for an article on what Ken Burns left out. Here he is writing about the Roosevelts, and there's a wonderful article by let me just see if I can find it, because I did bring it. And yesterday was Ruth Gruber's 104th birthday. So, and Ruth Gruber was still writing until about a year ago. Isn't that wonderful? Say who she is. Ruth Gruber wrote 18 books. She was a great journalist. She went to the Siberian Arctic and wrote a book. I Went to the Siberian Arctic was maybe her first book. She was a journalist for, excuse me? Her dissertation when she was not even 20 was on Virginia Woolf, and it was called The Courage to Write as a Woman. And we reprint it. We worked to get it reprinted by Philip Turner when he was at Carolyn Company. And I asked Jane Marcus, who just passed. I noticed there was that, if you didn't know, Jane Marcus is no longer with us. I asked Jane Marcus to write an introduction for the book, and Jane Marcus said she stole my title. So I informed Jane Marcus that she wrote her dissertation before Jane Marcus was born. And then it did, and Jane wrote yes,
It did? Good.
it did change her mind, and she wrote a beautiful introduction. So that was the very first book. Yes, quite right. So I was looking for what Ken Burns had left out by this wonderful labor historian who wrote, "She was one of us," meaning she was one of the Union women. And Eleanor Roosevelt was a member of the union, the writers' union, the journalists' union. And I guess the thing that is solid about Eleanor Roosevelt that kept me aloft is that she never stopped growing and changing. She would look at things and decide based on what was, and about race and about justice, those were her big issues. She really was a visionary when FDR didn't want to talk about race, when, we have World War. I mean, in 1946, Eleanor Roosevelt actually says, "We cannot stand up in the world community for democracy as long as we have segregation and bigotry as it exists today." And that's her theme throughout until the day she dies. There were other things that I really could hardly stand. One of the things I could hardly stand was her choice of intimate friends, including her last great emotional friend, David Gurevich, her physician. And I had decided that I wasn't going to have him in my book. And my editor, who wants this book cut in half, said, "Are you kidding?" And when she had the book and it was all done from my point of view, she said, you just forget it. Just put him in.
Right.
So, and the good news is that caused me to rethink how I was pushing back, how I was running away from Eleanor Roosevelt's private life in the last years, because I don't like it. And I don't like Edna, and I don't like David, and it's hard to like Hick anymore because she's totally drunk all the time. And, Eleanor Roosevelt's surrounded by, talk about a mess, right? But I love this new play on Lorena Hickok. I don't know if you've seen it, but if you haven't seen it, it's worth seeing. And so I went back. And I added the reality of the last part.
I think one of the points that we must take away is, as you collect your own archives for your writing, and this includes everybody here, please make sure that eventually they find their way into an official archive so that you're not the last person ever to look at these papers. When I started out on my biography of Flora Shaw, which is probably taken a half a century so far. I was told by an archivist in Oxford, what you see is what you've got in our papers. She has some letters in her husband's extensive collection, the Lord Lugard papers, and you have whatever you can find that she wrote for the Times, and of course those columns were not signed. 2 years later, there was a written apology from that archivist because by that time, and I was working with a collaborator at that stage, we had uncovered a mass of papers about Flora Shaw, and there are now at the Bodleian the Flora Shaw Papers for future historians and biographers. And I want you all to take this to heart for your work too. Now, we few more minutes if there are any questions from the floor. Please go to the mic. It'll be easier for us all. We have someone on
Right there on the side, Louise.
Is it okay to?
Please.
Okay. Carla, I was wondering, at the beginning of your remarks, you talked a little bit about the legacy of second wave, and I just wondered if you could draw that out a little bit more for us. It sounded like you were presenting this issue as kind of a thorny problem that you were thinking about and bringing biography forward, and maybe how the second wave has helped, but also how it's time to ask perhaps some different kinds of questions.
I think you've actually already said it very beautifully, and thank you for drawing out my argument, which is that I think many of us came into the work we do impelled by a kind of lesson we got from the second wave of the importance of bringing back these neglected histories, these miswritten histories, these lost histories, that in many cases ended up creating for us a relationship to our subject matter that put us in the position of being rescuers. And the problem with being rescuers is it's really hard to tell a messy story. And the stories we really need are the messiest ones, not the ones in which our subjects look most noble, most perfect, right, most flawless. What we really need are the messiest stories. And I think that that part of the complicated legacy of the second wave and of the work we do, again, I'm being specific, as feminist biographers, is feeling called to a kind of a rescue mission. If it weren't for the rescue mission we learned from the second wave, I don't think we would do this work. But I think the downside of that has been, for many of us, a kind of discomfort with the mess we find and not enough conversation amongst us critically about celebrating that messiness. And so that was part of my argument.
Louise?
No, you have to use the mic, yeah.
It says unplugged now. You go to the other side.
How's that?
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
I'm Louise Burnick. I've been in this seminar since it started. I just want to share some good news. Not just secrets is what we're up against, but lies, as has been indicated all through the day, and particularly pernicious lies about political women. So no thanks to any of us. This week, Ethel Rosenberg has been declared innocent. Apologies were made on the steps of City Hall and to the family for her execution. And so I know I don't need to say this, but the awareness of lies, particularly about wives, daughters, and sisters, run throughout our history, and hallelujah, somebody finally told the truth.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm just having fun. I'm picturing
Speak
everyone
into the
that's
mic.
participating in the panel having martinis and trying to figure out who should be on the $10 bill, what woman. That's just an aside to make everybody laugh, by the way. One pedestrian question and then something else. How do you deal with a subject matter that you want so much, but you can't read the handwriting? And then the other thing, be honest about it, please. And then the other thing I'm wondering is, because you get to know your subject matter so well, do you ever have that feeling that they're talking to you and that they're trying to, no, because it happens when you write fiction, your characters talk to you. But I'm just wondering, do you ever get that feeling it's like, no, I think you're looking in the wrong place?
I want to answer that first. I went to see the place where my subject lived for a long, long time, and I saw the stairway inside that she designed, and I saw the bedroom that she slept in. And on the way back from that in the car, I was thinking about her, and I heard her say in a very upper-class English voice, "Who are you to think that you can understand and write about me?" And having thought about that for some time, I came up with an answer, and that was, "I'm alive and you're dead." Over to the rest of you.
I love that. I do actually, I have an answer for the handwriting, which relates to the second half of your question. Hurston's handwriting was wonderfully clear. I mean, she was, one of the graduates of the Palmer School. She had beautiful handwriting. But many of her papers survive in really poor condition, and they were waterlogged or otherwise hard to read. But women I wrote about in Miss Anne, many of them, like Josephine Cogdell-Schuyler, had this terrible handwriting in this. And I learned that if you read that stuff aloud, you end up knowing what the next word is in a way that is entirely different than reading it silently to yourself. I don't know if I would go so far as to say it is their voice speaking through you. I'm not very woo, so I probably wouldn't say that. In spite of my 10 years in California, I probably don't think that way. But it does work. If you are dealing with really bad handwriting and you just start reading it aloud, even if you can only get every fifth word, I've learned you get much more than you do otherwise. So try that. It was my trick.
That's a wonderful question. Eleanor Roosevelt had a terrible handwriting. I also read out loud when I'm reading her handwriting, and I try not to make things up. And let me just say, I couldn't find this article before, but it was Bridget O'Farrell who wrote this wonderful article in which she says of the portrayal by Ken Burns, he spent merely 35 minutes on Eleanor Roosevelt in this 17-hour Roosevelt series. And what he didn't deal with was the failure to rescue or race. And those were things that were in my very long interview with him that were on the cutting room floor. As for whether or not our subjects speak to us, I've had a couple of really metaphysical events. One, when I thought I was finished with volume 2, and I'd written the last sentence, which was a collection of people who Eleanor Roosevelt would take into the next volume that she was thinking about and what they were thinking about, 1939, and I have this list. And I was going to go swimming after I'd finished writing that, and I was going to change, and I stepped on a button which said, FDR, one more time. And I went back to that last sentence, and I didn't have FDR in that last sentence. So I thought that was really good. So there are, if you're open, there's no telling what you might hear. Right.
And Marnie, we haven't heard from you on this subject.
I've never been talked to by her. I actually knew her, and that was quite enough. I have not depicted what she was really like. She was like totally zany. And has a wonderful voice, which unfortunately in the first part of the book I can put in there. I mean, she talks about, she was in Las Vegas and Sinatra asks her out, and after the show, and she drives up to the hills with him, and he promptly fell asleep in the car. And then he made her promise not to tell anybody that he'd fallen asleep. But I mean, she always had these, and then there was Brando, and then there was, she had these wonderful zany aspects to her. But that's it, I know the voice.
My friends, it is 3 o'clock. We're going to have a 15-minute break, after which we are going to have our glorious keynote